Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first inspiring interviews, conversations about breath, where we invite breathwork facilitators on to talk about their journey into breathwork. My name's Benedict, and I'm the founder of Breathing Space School of Breathwork. And tonight I am personally really excited because our guest is a friend and a teacher and the person who inspired me to start Breathing Space. Part of me wants to leap in and tell him the story about tell a story of how I met him and how he inspired me and what he is. But really, I think I want you to experience him in his words rather than secondhand from me. So Anthony Abbagnano of Alchemy of Breath, a huge figure in the breathwork world. He has inspired thousands and thousands of people, not just with his breathwork, but with who he is as a man. And there's not many people that I meet that I look at and say, I would like to be more like you. You have a quality and a strength of character and a kindness and a purpose of vision and just an aura that has just made me go, okay, you're the real deal. So, Anthony, let's bring you on. Lovely to see you here.
Hello. Hello, and it's great to be, let me just get my screen height right there. It's great to be here. It's a real honor. I appreciate the opportunity to hang out with you, Ben. And you asked me to tell you about me, so I just want to go me. You know, that's it. That's what's here right now. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's also a great way to review my life when you tell me that I'm going to be talking about my life. So I'm curious as to.
Yeah, that's, and when I was thinking about inviting you on, I was thinking about what exactly is it that I would like to see and what is it that other people would like to see. And really,
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to repeat that because the signal departed for a second there.
Sure. The idea behind these interviews is to inspire people around breathwork. And the things that inspires me more than anything is hearing people's stories, about hearing how they got to where they are, about who inspired them and what inspired them. And for me, really, it is about hearing people's stories and their journey. So this is what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to invite you to tell us about your life story. But before we jump into that, where are you right now?
Well, before we even jump into that, I want to say I'm 65 years old. It's a long story, but I'm actually, we find ourselves in Cornwall at this moment. This is when the music stopped. This was the chair that we were sitting in, and we're eager to get back to Italy, but right now very much enjoying the country here and walks on a deserted beach. So.
What a nice way to put it, actually. When the music stopped, this was the chair that we were sitting on. Yeah. And it is a magical kingdom that you find yourself in there. So
yeah, it is. It really is. Yeah.
Well, if it's okay, before we start the interview, I would really just like to take 3 breaths with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a technique that you taught me, I think 5 or 6 years ago, about how you start your meetings, and I do it all the time now. And you said people will give you funny looks and look at you strangely, but it makes such a difference when you just sit down and do that simple practice of taking a breath with someone. So thank you for that gift, amongst many others.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Yeah, go ahead, please.
okay, so I was going to say, before we start onto your life story, I'd like to just, could you give us the 101 about you? I'm going to give you maybe 60 seconds, maybe 90 seconds.
God.
What facts do you think people would need to know about you if they've never met you before? Tell us about Anthony in 60 seconds.
Okay. Born in England from an Italian mother and an English father, educated, very mainstream boarding school, a rebel, very unhappy, moved away at 18, went to America, started his journey of discovery, came back to Europe in his 20s, and then found his Italian self in his 30s, and has been really traveling ever since to the East, learning, teaching, studying, practicing, being, and here I am. How did I do? How many is that? About 40, 45?
It's about 30 seconds, but that's fine.
Yeah, that's the overview, and of course, lots of twists and turns and events between the beginning and now.
Okay, well, let's start with being born in England 65 years ago. Tell us about the world and the life that little Anthony was born into.
Oh, when you say little Anthony, first of all, little Anthony is very present for me all the time. I still sleep with a teddy bear today, and when I hear you say that, he just goes, "Oh God, I get to be here too." So, thank you for putting it that way. And I was born into this was in '54, so about 9 years after the end of the war. I was born in London, and to a mother who was. Would have been a passionate Italian had she been in Italy, but did her very best to become English, and a father that was from the north. He was from Manchester, and I was the second child, and we lived in south of London, in Wimbledon. We lived at the time, and yeah, my memories go back as far as being. My brother was older than me, so I do have one memory of going into his classroom. Apparently, it was the first time I ever walked. I climbed out of my cot or pram or whatever it was, and I walked down the high street to his school, and I walked in to the classroom, and I said, "I want my brother back." And they all sort of laughed and giggled and gave me a cuddle and walked me back home again. But I think that was actually a significant beginning for me, because it was about community. It was about wanting people to be together, which has really been a motivating force throughout my life. And we lived down there till I was probably 3 or 4, and then we moved up more towards central London. And yeah, I have lots of memories about that. But very young age, I was put in boarding school. I was just 7 years and a couple of months old, and I was put into boarding school. And I think already it was very clear to me that something was not quite right about the world. It felt I was definitely an outsider to what was going on, and I say this also as encouragement to people who feel like they've been outsiders, that it's a very worthy place to have been. It was a tremendous education for me to be on the margin, to be on the edge of things, and never really to be in the middle. It had a weight of not feeling like I belonged, but it also had there was a training in there of observing and watching, and not necessarily buying into the story, I'll call it, into that solipsistic agreeing because everybody else is. And that was a bit of a paradox for me, because I always was seeking to bring people together, but I would look at gatherings of people and not feel like I belonged. And I think that was the beginning of my journey that brought me here distinctly, that took me away from that pathway that was very generously offered to me by my parents, that I was supposed to be a banker or a lawyer or something like that, but I'm afraid I just wasn't the right material. I just wasn't the right material for that. So,
Sure. And that notion of feeling like an outsider, I've seen you do this in workshops. You ask people to put your hand up if you feel like an outsider, and everyone in the room puts their hands up. So it's an extraordinarily powerful and common feeling, I think, for many people to have that feeling of not fitting in and not being outside. So there you are at 7 years old, being sent off to boarding school, and I get the impression that it wasn't an easy or joyful place for you to be. So tell us more a bit about your experience in boarding school, and then when you weren't in boarding school, what was your family? What was it like in London in the sort of late 50s and the early 60s?
I never ever thought anybody would ask me that question, as if you grant me an authority, but that I'm not sure I'm due. But what was it like? Well, boarding school, no, it wasn't pleasant for me. It was feeling disenfranchised, and I really wanted a family. I wanted my family to be together, and it couldn't be. So it was not an easy period for me, the whole boarding school story. And we used to come up to London. I was allowed up to London every third Sunday. My father would come and get me, and we'd drive up and we'd have lunch at home, and then spend a couple or 3 hours after lunch, and then he'd drive me back to school again. But it also taught me many things. It taught me a lot about cultivating a sense of strength. I think perhaps more than anything, it taught me about the transformation from a state of loneliness to one of solitude, to strength. And there was no one really there to give guidance. This was really very much sort of bump and run, a bit like a bumper car, just trial and error. But I think there was already a seed in me then that was both resilient and determined. And that path pretty much stayed that way for me all the way through boarding school. I went to one of the old type public schools after my prep school, and equally, that was a really tough experience for me. But I now look back at the gains that I got, and there was a tremendous amount that I'm very grateful for.
You mentioned your father there. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your parents and maybe what you've inherited from both of them.
Well, I'm half Italian, half English, so that makes me either passionately repressive or repressively passionate. You can take your pick. And there is an inner dialogue that's pretty much ongoing between the two, because I feel them both at differing times, sometimes at the same time. But remind me the question again. What was it?
Just if you could tell us a little bit about your parents, about your mother and your father, maybe what they've given you.
Well, my father was a very hardworking man, and he had an awful shock as a young man, in that he had to dress his father down as a 16-year-old, and that was a very tough event for him. And he then became very strong. As a 17-year-old, he went into the Air Force and during the war, and came out in that extraordinary environment that existed after the war, that sort of leveling, perhaps not that different to the experience that we're having or about to have right now. where you would fight alongside someone of greater standing or smaller standing, but it didn't matter. So he came out of the war as a fighter, very determined man, commercial man, a successful man. He started in the world of advertising, and if you've ever seen that Mad Men, he was a bit like the character Dan. He was very dapper, very very smart, very clever, very bright, and very persuasive. And he met my mother, who was a recent import from Italy. She actually came from Italy when she was just 17. And they met each other at the American embassy and swore to each other as sort of chuckling that I'll never get married. And 6 months later, they were married. And she was also an extraordinary being. Her mother was a dancer at the court of Naples, and she was from a wealthy family that lost everything during the war. And she was a very bright light, a creative, an artist, ceramicist, designer. And she moved to England as the bride, actually, of the commander of the British forces in Salerno. And that he was 63 and she was 17, so you can imagine it didn't last very long. So they arranged this rather strange charade of a divorce where she had to be seen walking into the Grand Hotel in Brighton and have it documented by a witness, and then they would be allowed to divorce as she was adulterous. And she met my father about 3 or 4 months after that experience, and they then stayed together until she died some 45 years later. So she was a passionate woman that, sorry.
So I was going to say, that sounds like something from a romantic novel, actually, Anthony. It's an extraordinarily vivid and exciting picture you paint of your parents there.
Yeah, I'm sure it was exciting for her. I hadn't even been thought of yet, but yeah, I think those were times similar to these now. You know, there's a lot gets jumbled up, and may we not have the suffering today that they had in those days.
And so what were they like from your point of view? What were they like as parents to you? What was the relationship with them like?
Pretty absent. You know, my mum, I think that was very hard for her. She was, I said she was a passionate woman, but she really sort of tried to put it in the English box to be proper and appropriate. And I think that cost her a lot. But she could get angry. She could be explosive. That was one way she would express her passion. But she was really, she tried to keep it suppressed. She was a mystic. She was a seer. She had an uncanny intuition. And she was very much behind my father's success. He was really quite successful in his work. He had an advertising agency in Oxford Street in London, and he sold it to an American or Canadian outfit just before the days of Saatchi's and all of those mega agencies came into being. But so she really stewarded him in a way with her immense amount of power. At the same time, she was a designer. She was a head designer, I think, for Marks and Spencer's right after the war for a good few years. And then they upped and moved to Italy. About the same time I left home, they moved to Chianti, where they started to make wine. My father became a winemaker, and that had been their dream. And so my life with them was somewhat distant, you might imagine. My father was usually working, maybe a week a year. He wasn't, but I remember every Sunday there was I have fond memories of him. I have fond memories of the smell of his lapel. He used to smoke a pipe with gold block tobacco, and to this day, if I smell that smell, it brings a very soft memory to me. And he but he was working all the time. We'd maybe see him. Every summer we would go to Italy to the old family pad, the sort of what was left of the estate down there, and my dad would come down for maybe 5 or 6 days, and we spent time there. And then I remember every Sunday he would have his beer at 11 o'clock in the morning. He wasn't alcoholic, but that was his ritual. With his Sunday paper. So I have very fond memories of him, but also a quite judgmental, quite frightened man, quite I think haunted from having to grow up too quickly with the whole war situation. And very loyal and devoted to my mother, a very devoted couple, very, very beautiful couple they had.
What were their names?
My father's name was John, and my mother's name was Palmina, which means little palm.
Palmina, little palm.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit strange, but would it all be okay just to have a breath with them both and to really acknowledge them in you and with us here?
Yeah, thank you. I can feel them enjoying that.
And what do you think they gave you? What have you inherited from? What are the gifts that they have passed on?
I think pursuit of excellence. I think a strength of will. I feel much of my leadership has components of teachings that they gave to me. I have to say most of what I learned wasn't from what they said; it was from who they were, and I think that was a big teaching for me too. I was very quick to disbelieve people who spouted from the mouth, people who try to pass information as if it's wisdom and confuse the two. And they did that, so I was quick to argue and quick to rebel. But I think really the qualities in their being were the ones that were exceptional and that I bow to were the distinction between loyalty and sycophancy, and also a sense of, I'm going to use a dangerous word when I say this, but a sense of entitlement, that we're not meant to be small as human beings. So I mean it in the sense of the call to show up. Let's not be lazy about this. And I'm guessing that came from that post-war era, after suffering as much as they did, that when the dust cleared, that the horizon was that much more graspable. And I think that's particularly been an influence in my life, is that I'm entitled to try my best. I'm entitled to do whatever I can. And I'm very grateful for that. And honestly, I'm really grateful for that nasty, horrid education I had too. I get to speak more than 2 or 3 languages. I write. I enjoy writing. I've been given a great education, really, on a practical level. So I remember saying at the time how much I hated it, and people would say, "You'll change your mind," and I'd go, "God, I'll never change. I'm going to make up my mind now that I'll never change my mind. I'd never send my children to a school like that." But I have changed my mind. I wouldn't want to do it again, but I'm very grateful for the way it taught me.
Okay, so let's take us I mean, I'm getting an impression of your school years, and I can imagine you as a young firebrand rebel. As a teacher, I can easily imagine you, Anthony, being that rebellious, you know, entitled, sure of himself, very confident. I can see, what you've described of your father, that strength of character and purpose in you, even as you were a very young man as well. So I can imagine there's maybe a few teachers there that thought, I hope, well, I don't know. Let's talk about your teachers at the school. One of the things that I find is everyone usually has a memory of one teacher who inspired them, who made a difference to them. Is there someone from your school career who was like that for you?
Well, there was, but I would never have thought of him that way. But there was, yeah. There was a man, he was named Mr. Hardwick, and he was the reverend at my prep school. So I would have been under his tutelage from sort of 7 until 11 or so, 11 and a half. And he was perhaps the one person that demonstrated an interest in who I was and how I felt. The rest were definitely cardinal points on my map, on my chart, but on the journey that I traveled as a youngster, but mostly, lighthouses because there were rocks there. There was danger of some sort or another. But he was a remarkably warm man and very correct. And I used to go visit his study, and I used to talk to him about spiritual things as a young man. And he, as we say today, held space for that. And that was remarkable if you think back to 1960 or 1961, that someone would have had the presence of mind to afford a young child that possibility to explore that. So I would say he was definitely a landmark in terms of who inspired me as a child, and I think that gave me very necessary sustenance in a world that was very unspiritual to me and very hurtful and callous. So, and fearful. I mean, the threat of being beaten was always there, and it was a scary time in those days. The methods of discipline were somewhat archaic. People would get arrested now if they did the things that they did then. So he was definitely an oasis in a very dry psycho-spiritual desert. Yeah.
Mr. Hardwick.
Mr. Hardwick, bless him. Thank you, John Hardwick.
Let's have a breath for Mr. Hardwick as well, if you're watching.
Yeah, let's have a breath for Mr. Hardwick. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds like quite a brutal education, quite a tough education, and of course there are so many benefits now. But tell us about the young man that your education and your family, with your distant relationships with your parents. What kind of young man did that forge?
I think I was a little bit shell-shocked. I was a little bit shell-shocked by it all, and but I was a seeker by the age of by then already, and I met breathwork when I was 10, and that was a very clear validation of the part of me that felt discomfort having to fit into this physical manifestation of life that we have.
Would you like to tell a story about how you discovered breathwork?
Yeah,
or your experience?
Yes, I was picked on because I was half Italian, of course, and we weren't supposed to be anything other than English at boarding school. But I was picked on, and a fellow gave me a paper bag, and he said, "Go on, breathe into this." And so I did. He said, "Breathe 20 times." And so I breathed 20 times, and he said, "Bigger, more, bigger breaths." So I breathed Wim Hof style and into a paper bag, and And then he said, okay, now hold your breath. So I held my breath, and he squeezed me from behind. He put his arms around my chest, and he squeezed me. He said, okay, exhale. And then I exhaled, and he let me down to the ground. And I had visions. I saw the why, and I saw the purpose, and I knew that I was visiting here from another place. And my suspicions, because I can think of an analogy, like right now during this virus. I remember 6 weeks ago I was doing an event in London, and I was asked by one of the breathers who was part of Cocaine Anonymous, said, would you come and do a breath work with us? So I said, yeah, sure. I said, where is he? He said, it's way down east London, and I was in West London. So I took the train, I took the underground, and I put on a mask, and I was the only person I saw that day putting on a mask. So you know what it's like when you're the first one to do something different. There's that potential of falling into the crevice of self-consciousness and embarrassment, and actually not doing what you feel is right because enough people around you would judge it and would suggest that another way is more appropriate. So that was very much my experience with my childhood, was feeling like, God, I feel like I know something here. I'm connected to something here, but there's no one to talk to. There's no one who understands it. And in fact, everybody thinks I don't belong because I'm nuts. So that experience at 10 years old was also a very powerful validation for me. And it reminded me of some kind of central truth that belonged here, and that as a race we were distracted from it in some way, in hundreds of thousands, millions of ways, but distracted from it. It was kind of like discarded or dispensed with in favor of this, trappings and ego and all that other stuff. And that continued for me as a young man in my early teens. I was very curious, studying, trying to understand. I'd go into church. At Harrow, we used to have to go into church every morning before class, and I'd go into church and I'd watch this, that I was very irreverent. I was disgusted, I was angered, and I was cheeky, and I was a rebel. It was like shenanigans to me that people would put on robes and colors and this sort of thing, and I was unable to see the benefit in it. I'm much more forgiving now, I have to say. I do see there's something there, that there's an essence under there that is, again, often forgotten. But I was looking for something else. I was looking for unity. I was looking for a sense of peace that it felt like people had allowed it to be taken away from them, and it felt like it was a divine right that had somehow been forsaken. Love.
So a seeker for love
Mm.
as a young man. Okay, so tell us where your seeking took you then, when you left school, when you set out. Tell us what this young rebel, where he went and what he did, and how his adventures happened.
Well, I do remember I was 14 years old, and I'd saved up enough money, and I bought a motorbike, and I couldn't drive it until I was 16, but I bought it, and I kept it at a family's house in Barnes. And on my holidays, I'd go down there and I'd sit on it and I'd polish it. And it represented to me my magic carpet. It represented to me my key to freedom. And I'd been so contained by my boarding school experience that I just couldn't wait to escape. So I would lie in bed at night and fantasize about the wind in my face and my knuckles white on the handlebars as I'd lean into corners and drive down to the south of France and go to Italy and all over Europe on my little Honda 50. And there were two or three of us that sort of clubbed together with this great idea. And so sure enough, I did. I took my A-levels early. I took them at 16 and then said, that's it, I'm out of here. And I actually got expelled about the same day as the end of term. They managed to crush my whole career at Harrow by expelling me hours before I was due to get my old boy's tie and to be a graduate. And anyway, I skipped off to the south of France with a friend of mine, and we slept on the beach in Nice. And we had a job in a local bar. We'd be making frites, and for the cocktail hour, so we'd be in there making chips for a couple of 3 hours. One of us would do one day, one would do the other, and we'd sit on the beach and see this is of course the hippie time. So there were people out there with guitars and little bonfires and this very sweet atmosphere on the beach. And after this freshness of escape, this call to action into my adulthood, it's a bit like the hero's journey. You're just like, I'm out of here. I'm into a new world. And Colin disappeared. My friend disappeared one day from the beach, and I didn't know what had happened to him. And so I stayed there a couple more nights, and I'd also been going into the post office every day to see if there was a telegram from my dad, who was going to tell me what A-levels I'd passed or what my grades were going to be. And one day I was in the post office waiting in the queue, and there was this woman in front of me who was arguing with another woman about who was in front, who was before who. And I was just looking at this, and I said, I'm sure it's going to be okay. Everybody will get their chance, to get served. And she looked around at me, and she turned towards me, looked me in the eyes, and she became the mother of my first child. As a young, fresh 18-year-old, my first child was born, or I was about 18 years and 7 months old when he was born. So that really changed my life. And of course, in retrospect, I understand all the reasons I did it and the whys and wherefores, but it changed my life. It took me very much out of the trajectory that my parents had so hoped that I would take. And she was also a very spiritual being. And we would take, what drug was it we took? I think mescaline. In those days, we took mescaline and we took LSD together, and we traveled. We did psychic journeys of enormous importance to me. And by the time I did get my very bad A-level results, we were already a couple. And Colin was fine. He was, no problem with him. He came back safe and sound. And within probably, I think 2 weeks after my 18th birthday, we became married, and then we left for America that October. So I then began a whole experience of living in the States.
Okay, wow. So that time between leaving school and then becoming a father, it feels like a short time in time, but it feels like such a momentous time in your life. I mean, driving a motorbike as a 16, 17-year-old down to France and living on the beach, and with all the hippies in the late 60s and early 70s, meeting the mother of your children in a post office queue, working in a cocktail bar, cooking chips. It's again, it feels like a movie, Anthony.
Yeah, it's a movie.
Enough life to have, most people do all of those things over the space of 5-10 years, and you crammed it all into just a few months.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
What do you think about when you look about if you could speak to that young man, just like on the cusp of the world, what would you say to him now? And what do you think he would say to you?
I would just wish him more courage. I think he was very courageous. Sometimes he traded off rashness instead of courage, but I think he was very courageous. He was really struck by a very powerful principle of love. I mean, that was what I was always wanting, people to love each other my whole life. So I think that was, I would say my message to him would be to rock it, stay with that. You're on a good wicket there, stay with that. Have faith in yourself and trust that when you ask people about love, that their gruff reaction doesn't mean that they're not interested. Trust that underneath, that's what everybody really wants. It's what we're all aching for. So be the instrument.
All waking for that.
Yeah.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the joy of my work now, is that that's what I do. I get to create sacred space for people to love themselves. It's the most rewarding thing I could ever hope for.
And do you think young Anthony, what would he say to you about if he could look at your life now and what you're doing and your life's purpose?
I think if I was him and I was talking to me now, I would say, tell me what to do so I don't have to waste all this time. Because you're exactly what I want, but why am I taking all these different directions? It seems like a very circuitous route. You know, give me the ticket, give me the map, or whatever it is, that I don't have to do it. But I also I also fully understand that, you know, there came a moment in my life, and I've seen it with a few of my breathers too. There comes a moment where we really grok it. We really get that all of those choices we made and apparently irrelevant acts we did, some of them even hurting other people, you know, some of them really antagonist to what we would want to reflect on our deathbed, for example. But actually, there comes a moment where there's a complete understanding of why, and that all those random acts were not random at all. They were all stepping stones, and this destination could never be reached without those stones having been stepped on. So that was a moment of immense release, you know, really, like the struggle. I remember always saying as a kid, the experiment is over. We've got to get this right. I remember in my teens and my 20s, it was like, the experiment is over. Stop screwing up. We've got to get this right. And at the same time, screwing up all the time. So, you know, I think the screw ups are really valuable. They're really important.
The screw ups, the stepping stones. And what a big one that was, as to be a father at 18 and move to America. So tell us about what made you do that and what happened when you were there. And well, actually, before we do that, your partner, we haven't named her. Is that okay to do that? Is that just okay?
Yeah, of course. Renee. Yeah. Renee, reborn.
Renee. Okay, so you and Renee in America. Tell us a little bit about what that was like with a young child or a child on the way.
Well, America, you know, for a young English boy that had come out of public school was extraordinary. Within one day, we had a loan, we had an apartment, we bought a car. You know, we were like, it was America. You know, it was like boom, it's all happened, and so we moved into our apartment, and we had no furniture, and she was pregnant. Damien, my son, was born in February, and this was now late October, November. So she was really quite pregnant. She flew which was to Omaha, Nebraska. She flew, and I flew to New York, and then hitchhiked to save the money to get there. And so we lived a very simple life, and a very beautiful life. This child was born. He was a miracle child, and absolutely wonderful. Oh gosh, what can you say? But I was just a kid too, so I was definitely in awe and appreciation, but I was not prepared. I was not ready for this kind of experience. But I did have this feeling that I had this knowing that if I could look into his eyes and connect with him, that it would all be all right. There was something about that eye contact with him that was a wordless reassurance that love was all that mattered. That was all that mattered. So even if I did mess up, that if the love was there, that was what was most important for him.
Wow.
And
hang on, I just need to just stop you there. If we can just connect with someone, look in their eyes, and know that love is all that matters. That's, something not just to do with your children. That's something to do with everyone. To look in to connect, to look in your eyes and know that love is all that matters.
Yeah. But isn't that why we do this work?
I think so.
Yeah.
Sorry, so I interrupted you there. So, your son was born, you're living a simple life. Were you working then?
I was a salesman. I was employed as a salesman. I used to sell water refining equipment. It was very, very difficult to do. It was completely against my Englishness to do that, but very uncomfortable. And I did it for maybe a few months, a year or something. And then I got involved in construction. After that, I started to do building work, and the marriage didn't last for very long. The marriage only lasted. We got there in '72, and we were by September '74. She had left, and she took Damien with her, and that was then the beginning of the first dark night of the soul for me. Perhaps not the first, but a very big dark night of the soul for me. It was a very challenging. So I was 21, 20, no, I was 19, 20, I was 20, just 20. Damien was 1.5. That was really, really life challenging.
One of the things that has always struck me about you, Anthony, is the way that you have been able to transform your own suffering into a gift that you bring out to others. And I remember that from one of the very first times that we met, that you had this ability to turn, amongst the greatest teachers that I have met, can transform their own suffering into their own gift that they bring to the world. Do you feel able to tell us about that dark night that you went through, or that probably not just one night, I'm guessing, probably a longer period? And it's okay.
Yeah,
it
was
not something you want to go down.
No, I'm happy to talk about it. Renee and I had a very powerful relationship. We were really explorative. We did a lot of inner work together, and but she was older than I was. She was when I was 16, she was 24, so she was eight years older than I was. And when we were married, she was already 26 by then. which to me seemed like a very mature woman. Of course, now I see 26 as someone on their path, but not a very mature woman. But so we were not able to sustain a marriage. I think I was an idol for her, and an ideal. And I was quite a beautiful young boy, so she was really very attracted to me. And in retrospect, I understand I wanted to get out of the life that had been prescribed for me. So I married because it gave me a sense of opportunity and chance for something to recreate a life that I wanted to create. But I was no way I was ready for something like that. And I remember my father, such a decent man, that he tried his level best to stop me. But of course, at the time, when your father comes over the night before the wedding, he flew over from Italy to try to stop me getting married. It was like, now you're just making me more determined. I was the rebel, so I had plowed ahead and been brash and had to pay the price. But what happened essentially was that our spiritual explorations, Renee's spiritual exploration, took her in a different direction than mine did. And she found a movement that was of particular interest to her called the Unification Church. And she was visited by them a couple of times. Her brother had gone there earlier and had joined this movement, and he encouraged her and invited her to go visit them in Colorado. And so she took Damien and she left. And that was quite a shock for me. It was like all of a sudden, boom, I knew the marriage was not safe and wasn't going to last. I think if I'd had more courage, I might have said that I wanted it to end, and done it in a way that could have been more wholesome for all three of us. But I didn't have that kind of maturity. I was just wounded. I was devastated by what happened, and the story that came, somehow I believed the story that I'd abandoned my son, whereas actually I hadn't abandoned him at all. But it was the judgment of this organization that I was, if I was not going to join them, that I was to be considered a devilish influence. So the next 4 or 5 years of my life were quite tormented, especially the first 2, because a part of me believed it. Part of me believed that I was unworthy. And so while we were there, Renee, and we are friends now, by the way, I'm happy to say, as best as we can be, but Renee was a true believer, and she really did believe that the leader of this movement, Reverend Moon, was the second coming of the Messiah, and she pledged her allegiance to him at any cost. And that's what she did. She joined, and she took Damien with her, and then I was judged for not being with him, not being a father to him. And so she would call me at any time during the night or day and try persuade me to go to Colorado to be with them. And then after a few weeks, I went there, but they wouldn't allow me to see him. I had to be subjected to their initiation program, and I wouldn't do that, so I left. And then after another few weeks of really awful dark moments, I went back again. But I said, this time you have to promise me that I'm going to be able to be with him. And so I said, yes, you will. And so I got there, and again the same thing happened, that they would allow me to see him, but first I had to listen to their whole initiation process. I had to go through the induction process. So I did. I sat in a room, and normally they would have hundreds of people in a room, and they'd recruit people from this very, very big movement, street recruiting, a bit like the Hare Krishnas in those days. But this was all about Reverend Moon. And And so I did go through the induction process, which was an 8-day process, and it involved being in this lecture room with this one man, Philip Burley, who was the head of the whole church of the Northern Hemisphere, and he started to persuade me, and I think it was referred to as brainwashing. He started to put me through the process to get me to pledge my allegiance to the Unification Church. And this is, I have to say, I'm so grateful for having been to boarding school and having to have my hair clipped short and having to wear a shirt and tie. And that was something that I hated so much that, and I saw all these, they're called Moonies, all of these people, members of the church that were all in their blue jackets and black ties and looking so smart and clipped that I think that really gave me a lot of strength to resist the teachings. I was like completely refusing to engage the first few days, and then afterwards, after the first 3 or 4 days, he got me so upset that I started to argue with him by using numerology and what was known as the divine principle and so on. And once I started to argue, then I realized in retrospect that he had me. That was when he could use his power of persuasion. So this was it was engineered this way. The whole experience was engineered in such a way that one would engage if one was resistant, and then once you engage, you can be persuaded. And so I sat there for the other 5 days. And this, you're allowed to sleep 4 hours at night, and then there's singing every morning at 4 a.m. and you're only fed carbohydrates. You're never alone. You sleep under lock and key with one guy beside you there, another one there. There's always someone on your arm. I wasn't allowed out. I went out once, and I had one person on each arm when I went to the post office. It was a very, very dark, horrid experience, and then I decided that the only way I was going to get through this was to comply. So I just stopped arguing and said, yes, I get it. I get it. And as it came to the end of the 8 days, there was this sort of celebratory atmosphere of, he's going to join us, Anthony's going to join us. And so I remember coming out of the room, and Renee was there, and her brother was there, and Damien was there in her arms, and it was like, oh, we're all going to be together again. And I bolted. I ran out the front door, and they ran after me, and I ran for as long as I possibly could. It must have been 15 or 20 minutes of just flat out running, and I got to a phone box, and I called a friend of Renee's, who'd actually married us. He was a priest, and he was living in Berkeley in California. And I called him up, and he said, just come here, don't worry, just get a plane, just come here, I'll take care of you, it's okay, you're safe, you're not wrong, you're not the devil, you're okay. And this call was a pivotal moment for me. It was tremendously strengthening, and I strode back into that building, it was an ex-convent in Boulder, and I strode back in there with fury as my ally, and said, "You're not going to do this to me. You're not going to control me like this." And I'm going to California. So and they immediately crumbled. They immediately acquiesced and said, "Okay, fine. It's all good. Of course, you can go. You could go." And Renee said, "Well, but just come. We want to say a prayer for you before you go. Please come upstairs." So I went up with her and her brother, and Damien was no longer there again. And we sat, and there were maybe 8 or 9 of us in a circle. And he was a very clever man, Philip Burley, and he started a prayer that was so powerful, as he talked about me going into the hands of the devil and having made such a terrible choice, and could we hold a door open for his heart to heal and come back to it, blah, blah, and so on. I was so stressed that I went into a spontaneous nosebleed, and I started just gushing blood over my trousers and my shirt and the floor. And this was taken as a great sign of the truth, that this was the devil in me, and so I maintained. I got out of there. I got into my van. I had a little camper van that I'd made, and I was going to drive to California. And Renee came down with Damien in her arms, and I was, you can imagine, distraught. I'd lost my son. Everything had gone pear-shaped. I was in a total mess. And she came to me and she said, "I'm going to come with you." And I said, "What?" She said, "We're going to come with you to California. We're going to go to the Hearst Mansion, which they just bought in San Francisco, and or in the East Bay or something." And I said, "Whoa." And I looked at Damien, and I had this, this turmoil of, oh, I get to be with him, and I've got to be with her, and how am I gonna? And so I said, "Okay, but we're not going to talk about the church. We're not going to talk about the family, the church, the dogma, the doctrine, the divine principle. We're not going to talk about anything. Do I have your word on that?" And she said, "Yes, of course." And so we left. We drove. And within 15 minutes, she started talking about why I'd made the wrong decision. So I realized that the only way I was going to be able to manage this was to pick up hitchhikers. So I picked up 2 hitchhikers. And I thought, well, maybe she can chew on them, instead of me, poor people. And they did come on board, and they drove with us the whole way to California, and they both joined the church. So my thanks to them, and I hope that they're happy. And I went to visit this priest, John, and I stayed with him, and almost suicidal, just completely in pieces, not knowing what would happen with my life at all. And that spin lasted for a couple of years until I met an old man who just said some very simple words to me, which was, "If you want your son back, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to make it happen." And so I did. I got a proper job. I conformed. I got a good lawyer. I became the first person to sue the church for custody, the first male as well, and I was given custody about 2.5 years later, after a very difficult journey. So Damien became my son again, but the greatest sadness to me was that eye contact had gone. And I'd look in his eyes and I'd see someone that had lived other things. And it felt that there was a part of him that I couldn't see anymore. So fast forward, Damien is now the president of the Unification Church. And he's a very fine young man. I couldn't be a more proud father. But he went and joined the church when he was 21 years old, and he's doing great things for them. He's helping them awaken to a grander perspective, I think. But there's still that curious element of, where are you? So it's yeah.
So, as far as dark nights go, Anthony, that is a dark night. And I feel that young man in his 20s, what a journey to go on. What a responsibility to bear. My heart really goes out to him.
Yeah, mine does too. Thank you. You didn't. We never talked about this, did we? I don't think we ever talked about this, did we?
I knew a small part of the story, actually, in our very first meeting when we met in Ubud in 2014. You told me a very short version of this story. So I knew it was in there. And something, actually, is it okay if I just talk for a second? And I'd like to confess something. And I feel bad about saying this, but one of the reasons I wanted to meet you was because we corresponded because we were neighbours, or you owned a property in Brighton near to me, and I'd seen your picture on Facebook, and we corresponded. And when me and Jen were in Ubud, I thought, this is my opportunity to meet you, and I wanted to meet you because I thought you were a cult leader, because you had the long white hair and the soft white linen clothes, and I feel really hearing your story about what that really is truly like to be involved with an establishment that does do brainwashing and puts people through such terrible experiences. It weighs heavily on me to have thought that about you. So that's my confession, that I took that lightly without knowing any of your story around that.
Yeah, well, it's, again, like I said earlier, that all these disparate events, these extreme opposites and things that seem irrelevant come into relevance. And that whole experience with the cult for me, it took me until I was 45 or 45 to be able to talk about this without the adrenaline surging inside. I mean, it's really been a long time for me to come to peace about it. But now and for many years it cauterized my spiritual development, my spiritual interest. I was like, I don't want to hear anything about spirit. I just want to drink beer and whatever, work in the foundry or whatever I was doing, was I was in such my life had gone to shit, and I was just seeking to survive. But with what I learned about cults, it was enormously helpful in the work that I do now. It's, as you probably know yourself, it's a very fine line between, people give you adulation and want to put you on a pedestal, and it's a very easy thing to fall into a spiritual egotism that would allow you to believe that that pedestal is real. And and yet on the other hand, there are parts of a cult that are extremely valuable. I mean, the word culture comes from the word cult. So if we're going to redescribe a new culture in the world today, a lot of what I do does look like a cult. Not the white hair. I mean, I don't do that on purpose. That just happened. But the concept that if we can believe in something that's bigger than we are, and we have a common belief, that it's cause for unity and worship. And the catch is, what is that thing that we believe in? And there's only one thing that I can think of that is appropriate, and that's the breath, because it knows no denomination. There's no need for any interpreter. There's no need for me to tell you what your experience is or why it's that way, or tell you about God or whatever word one would use for that. It's just an intensely personal, unique experience. And yet it's bigger than all of us. It's not even ours. We just get lent it every few seconds and we have to give it back. So the whole experience for me of being in a cult has really, I believe, enabled me to toe the line in terms of, yes, I can be a leader, but I'm not going to do your thinking for you. And I don't want your power. That's not what I'm interested in. And I specifically don't want you to believe in me because of your need to believe in something. I'm really happy that you believe in the power of breath, but that's not mine. I'm not going to call it the Anthony Abbagnano breath. It's just all of us, and they're all good, and they all forms of breath work are worthy of our awareness and our respect.
Which seems a remarkably good time to maybe just take 3 breaths maybe with that story and to really feel it. And like, I am so humbled by your story and so profoundly grateful for you to have shared that with me and with the people watching today, to have known that part of your journey and to know some of the fires that helped temper you into the teacher and the leader that you have become now. So is it okay to just, I need a few breaths if that's okay, just to really
let's take a few breaths. Yeah.
help breathe, help feel those fully. Thank you. Now, it was my original intention to try and persuade you to do 2 interviews, one about your life story, your inspiring life story, and then one about breathwork. But it feels, I mean, we've already gone an hour and a quarter and we're not even halfway through your life. So, Anthony, would you be willing to come back and tell us the rest of the story of your life?
Oh gosh, you mean the really dark bits? Yeah, okay.
Even dark? Yeah, then definitely, we definitely need to hear those stories.
We like the grit, yeah. Okay.
The protein, as I've started calling it from you.
Yeah.
Well, I can't say, in that case, I can't say what an honor again and a pleasure it is to have you both as a friend, but more as a teacher, to be on here and to share your story. It means a lot to me to be able to hear that. And I know that for the people who watch this, that is an amazing story that you have just told us. Tender and dark and full of so much power and learning that it's not surprising you are the man that you are. Maybe it is surprising that you have become all of those, because of those experiences. You are who you are, and you've been able to do what you do now. So thank you, Anthony, again.
Thanks, Ben. And much love to you all out there who find this on your screen. Many blessings to us all. May we all be present with what's going on in the world today, and may we all reach deep inside for all those parts in us that need to be held and loved.
What a beautiful prayer to end on. So we'll finish the interview now, and we'll arrange maybe for a time to connect again and to carry on our conversation. So thank you very much, Anthony, from Alchemy of Breath. What an honor it was to have you here today. Thank you.